then how can you gauge whether the cost of monopoly, even if you assume that there is such a thing as a cost of monopoly, is greater or smaller than the cost of antitrust action? How can you know whether, when you are approving a merger, whether the deadweight loss will be greater or productive efficiency? If you knew such a thing, then you can abolish the market altogether. You don't need any process of experimentation by firms doing this or that. If you, as a judge or a bureaucrat, can know ex ante in advance such things. So that's one of the explanations of why that Hayek gave, and Mises as well. I think that unpopularity of the Austrian economics is not so much ideological or whatever, but this methodological point, that it deflates the ambition of young economists to do great things in the world, to change things, and to plan what's going to happen.
I think that economists predict the future to show they have a sense of humor. Yeah, I wanted to go back to this market failure of public goods and externalities and monopoly and this and that and the other. And we think there is no such thing as a market failure. And a lot of what Austrians do is we show that that these are not market failures, whereas the mainstream, they love market failures. I wanted to mention another area where we Austrians diverge from the mainstream. They all have the view that there is such a thing as market failure. What's market failure? Externalities, monopoly, public goods, income inequality is a market failure. Don't ask. Now, here I have to credit Milton Friedman. What Milton Friedman said is, yes, there is monopoly is a market failure. And there's this dead weight loss triangle. We're not going to illustrate it now, but people who know micro, they know that there's a dead weight loss triangle. But to his credit, what he said is, look, it costs money to have antitrust. And we should only have antitrust if the cost of solving this dead weight loss triangle is less than the utility loss, which is sort of employment for all economists to start doing econometric work. And while I'm on all economists, do you know how many people the Fed employs? The Fed employs, I think, 500 economists with PhDs. So you can imagine why the Fed is so popular among economists, because it's a full employment law, whereas the Fed is just central planning of a very important part of the economy, money and interest rates, where the Austrian view would be, I don't know, gold or whatever the market wants. Now, Milton Friedman had this show called, what was it called? Whatever his TV show, what was it called? Free choice,
free to choose.
Free to choose. Well, whenever the economy was free to choose, they chose gold or silver, and yet he is a bitter opponent of gold or silver. So he's sort of contradicting himself a little bit there.
And that brings us back to some of these fundamental differences. I think somebody asked. Again, Hayek. I like these Hayek's formulations of the differences between Austrianism and Chicago School, because he has a particular sense of humor in how he formulates that. He says that Friedman and we agree more or less. They're both minimal state liberals. They didn't have much differences in terms of economic policy, but one big difference was about money. And he says Friedman believes that money is the key for everything. And I believe that money doesn't matter, that there is not much useful that an economist can say, apart from trying not to inflate the money supply. And when inflation in business cycle shows up, try to deflate as much as you can. And that's all, like a rough qualitative advice to be cautious with inflating the credit bubble. And that's it. There's not much interesting and scientific that I can say about it. Whereas Friedman had all kinds of these very sophisticated, precise ideas like constant monetary growth, but then the rate of monetary growth has to follow the growth rate of the real economy, and then if you have stable prices, then everything is gonna be fine. And Hayek said, no, that's that's not quite so. That there are other things going on, that you can have instability even if you have a relatively stable general price level, as we've seen many times during the Great Depression and in 2000s before the Great Recession. There wasn't much in a way of uh, inflationary pressures in the ordinary sense of the word that could be predictors of some macroeconomic instability. So
I think the
this idea,
problem.
Hayek was always like reducing the ambitions of economic science in the sense of how much it can predict. And that's maybe Mises and
Yes.
Rothbard are even more radical in that regard. Hayek at least allows some room for empirical verification. He's circumspect there, but he's not as extreme as Mises and Rothbard. But they basically agree that there is not much that you can predict, and that's one of the explanations of why that Hayek gave, and Mises as well. I think that unpopularity of the Austrian economics is not so much ideological or whatever, but this methodological point, that it deflates the ambition of young economists to do great things in the world, to change things, and to plan what's going to happen.
I think that economists predict the future to show they have a sense of humor. If we really knew the future, we'd be a lot richer than we are now. We predict only ceteris paribus, but ceteris is never paribus. There's always 10, 20 other things changing. So you really can't predict. I have to brag at this point. I once shook the hand of Mises. I actually did.
Good.
It was at his NYU conference, the last session of his NYU conference. Murray Rothbard brought a bunch of his living room cronies there. But I never washed his hand. It's a little dirty. So if you shake my hand, you channel Mises. And my other claim to fame is I once beat Hayek at chess. Now, my way of beating people at chess is I say, look over there, and I grab their queen off, and then I beat. No, I'm kidding.
He was really that good.
Well, he wasn't. I actually did beat him in chess without grabbing his queen. So those are my two bragging comments.
Very good.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to this market failure of public goods and externalities and monopoly and this and that and the other. And we think there is no such thing as a market failure. And a lot of what Austrians do is we show that that these are not market failures, whereas the mainstream, they love market failures. And Friedman, as I said, was a little bit better because he said it costs money to fix the market failures, which is common sense, but he still believes in market failures. Whereas we are, I don't know what, extreme free enterprisers or something like that. That would be the...
if I may just interject here, but not necessarily, because even if we are not kind of philosophical, laissez-faire radicals, the very methodological nature of the position pushes you in that direction. If you assume that the cost is subjective, what James Buchanan recognizes, opportunity cost is a cost of a loss, the value foregone from deciding to do X rather than Y, then how can you gauge whether the cost of monopoly, even if you assume that there is such a thing as a cost of monopoly, is greater or smaller than the cost of antitrust action? How can you know whether, when you are approving a merger, whether the deadweight loss will be greater or productive efficiency? If you knew such a thing, then you can abolish the market altogether. You don't need any process of experimentation by firms doing this or that. If you as a judge or a bureaucrat can know ex ante in advance such things. So that's another, this disconnect between the micro subjectivist basics that all of them pay the lip service to. James Buchanan wrote maybe the most important book about that, The Cost and Choice. Says that cost is subjective, and he it's pretty much Misesian, Robinsian book. He follows the Austrian tradition, his most Austrian book, he said. And everybody more or less agrees at the level of microeconomics. And then once you try to apply that in the policy area, then all of a sudden you forget about that. And then externality, the same thing, whether the social cost, whether is there a social cost or not, or is it a positive externality? What is the size of the externality? What is an optimal PIGU tax if you want to deal with global warming? Come on, hello. Are you the same guy who said 15 minutes ago that cost is subjective and impossible to measure? Impossible to measure. So that's one abyss that opens once for your ambition to be a social planner or a government interventionist, if you really seriously accept this cornerstone assumption of the Austrian economics that used to be the cornerstone assumption of the whole theory, economic theory.
We've criticized Keynesians, we've criticized Chicagoans. Now it's public choice turn. Now, you mentioned Cost and Choice by Buchanan and Tullock, and that was his most Austrian book. But the public choice school, I think, also deserves a little criticism. On the other hand, we have to acknowledge that the Chicago and the public choice, along with Austrians, are the three free enterprise schools of thought. But Austrian is better than the other two. So let me jump in against the public choice a little bit. One of their big publicity things is a thing called rent seeking. What's rent seeking? Rent seeking is you go to Washington, D.C., and you bribe somebody to give a tariff against the importation of these pens because you make these pens. Another one is you go and you want a subsidy. And the public choice is very good at pointing out rent seeking. But why do they call it rent seeking? I mean, rent is a perfectly legitimate thing. You rent a car, you rent an apartment, you rent a lawnmower, or economic rent. You're making $1 million. Your next best option is 200,000, so your rent is 800,000. Rent is a perfectly good thing. Why pick a nice thing to call a bad thing? It just shows that they don't have their I don't know what moral caps on or something. They should call it booty seeking or pirate seeking or theft seeking or something would be more accurate. Another criticism I have of them is the way they look at the government is like a business. There's a business that makes pens, there's a business that makes rubber bands, and then there's a business that makes government. They're just another business. This is appalling. From an ethical point of view, I mean, government is a coercive institution. They're the only ones who can legally take your money from you in taxes, and you never agreed to pay. I never signed anything such that I have to pay. Now, not all Austrians are anarchists. Some are. Some are limited government. But at least even the limited government Austrians don't see the government as just another company. So this is a big flaw in the public choice.
If I may add, somebody said that the loot seeking would be a better moniker than rent seeking. Loot seeking.
Root, R-O-O-T?
Loot. Like looting.
Loot seeking, L-O-O-T.
Again,
yes.
I will have to go back to this theoretical perspective. There is a method in that madness, so to speak. There is a theoretical reason why they use the concept of rent, because they're beholden to this Marshallian microeconomic analysis in which rent is important. There is this equilibrium, constant zero profit that characterizes perfectly competitive market. And if market doesn't work properly, you have this extra profit, extra return on investment, which is called rent, which is something suspicious. So that's what I think where their allergic reaction to rents come, and why they feel comfortable using the term, a beautiful and important term, rent. Just read Frank Vetter, the most important Austrian who developed the most comprehensive and best theory of rent as a positive thing, exactly along the lines that you mentioned, that they're renting a car, renting this. It's perfectly legitimate concept, but they don't use, that's economists. They use the usual and common terms to designate something completely different, and they feel comfortable using this concept of rent be, as something negative, because they come from an economic tradition that in general considers the rent to be a problem, something to be eliminated, or whatever. It's a quasi rents in Marshallian theory. Even some of the best non-Austrian economists, I would say, like Armen Alchian, for example, which is great. He's still in his best textbook that he wrote, this university economics, he uses a lot this Marshallian apparatus. That's one of the things that frustrates me with those Chicago economists that I like the most, like Harold Demsetz or Armen Alchian, that they're so heavy on this Marshallian price theory and microeconomics instead to use the Mengerian, the Austrian theory. They have many good pieces of technical analysis and reasoning in many areas, but there is at the fundamental level, as what I'm skeptical about is that this Marshallian microeconomics, and Milton Friedman and Stigler are probably, you know that probably better than I do. They're the most instrumental in reorienting American economics towards Marshallian paradigm. And that
I also wanted to mention Ronald Coase.
Ronald Coase.
He's from England, but he was a professor at Chicago, and he is considered a Chicago economist. And I've done a lot of criticism of him. Let me just take 2 minutes to say what's going on here. You are now wearing a black shirt. It's a very nice shirt. And I value that shirt at $500. You value the shirt at $5. So in the zero transactions cost world, I would get that shirt because I would offer you 200 and you only value it at $5. You'd make $195. I value it at $500. I make $300. And but there are transactions costs that keep us from making every possible trade. But in the zero transactions cost world, similar to the perfect competition, I would get that shirt. Okay, I think that's not unreasonable. But now I'm suing you for that shirt. I claim it's my shirt. And the Coasean judge, the advice that Coase gives to the judge is, whoever would have got the shirt in the zero transactions cost world, give it to the person in the real world. So now I'm going to get that shirt, which is preposterous. Why should I get the shirt? Because if I get that shirt, the GDP goes up by $495 because I value it at $500. You only lose $5 worth. I gain $500. So 500 minus 5 is $495, and I'm going to get your shirt. I mean, again, I had a full head of hair before that.
Walter, I know you a long time, but I never told you this. You know how I came to, I got the interest in Harold Demsetz by reading your debate with him about Coase, that argument that you developed. And I was flabbergasted. It was self-evident for me that you were right and then he was wrong about that. And then later on, I discovered that he has also very good, very pointed criticism of Coase himself, actually. Demsetz.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. You'll have to send me that stuff.
He was very critical of the Coase theorem. I remember there was the entire conference about Ronald Coase a couple of years after he died, and Richard Epstein was there and a bunch of other Chicago economists, and then Harold Demsetz comes along and delivers like a blistering attack on Coase.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, I said that. So that's Coase. This idea that property rights. That's probably why Demsetz was skeptical, because Coase completely does away with the basic assumption of private property rights. If the judge assumes that you stealing a shirt from me will maximize the total utility, then go ahead with it. That's one aspect. And another aspect is our perennial problem. What is the basis to believe that the judge will have a comparative advantage in figuring out those figuring out
How does the judge know that I value it at 500? I mean, for an
uh,
Austrian, the way to determine whether I valued it at 500 is did I buy it for 500 or more,
yeah. So, so,
or
so,
less?
so it's very serious thing. Essentially, it boils down to some kind of central planning. Actually, you ascribe to a judge the ability to perform a function of central planning commissar in socialism. He knows what kind of business decision will be welfare maximizing in the long run, market be damned, and or what individual agents think about it be damned. So that's and I think that Demsitz also used this kind of